What do you say to the most powerful military commander in the world when his carefully laid plans are crumbling before his eyes and the fate of millions hangs in the balance? On the cold morning of December 17, 1944, Winston Churchill sat in his war room at 10 Downing Street, staring at intelligence reports that would have broken lesser men. The Allied advance across Europe, which had seemed so certain just weeks before, was now threatened by the most audacious German counteroffensive of the entire war. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, was facing a crisis that would test every ounce of his leadership, and the Germans were exploiting every weakness in the American lines. The Ardennes Forest, a region both commanders had deemed too difficult for major operations, had become the stage for Hitler's final desperate gamble, and the American forces were being torn apart. Churchill knew that what he said in the coming hours could either steady the alliance or shatter it, and the weight of that knowledge pressed upon him like the winter snow falling across the frozen battlefields of Belgium. The British Prime Minister had spent 5 years navigating the treacherous waters of coalition warfare, balancing American optimism against British caution, and now he faced perhaps his most delicate diplomatic challenge. Eisenhower, the man he had championed and supported, the general who had led the greatest amphibious invasion in history just 6 months earlier, was losing control of the situation, and Churchill had to decide whether to support him publicly or demand changes that might fracture the alliance. The old bulldog understood that wars were won not just on battlefields, but in the quiet rooms where leaders either found the courage to speak truth or the cowardice to remain silent, and silence was never Churchill's way. If you're fascinated by the hidden conversations that shaped history and the moments when great leaders faced their greatest tests, then subscribe to this channel right now because we're going to take you inside the room where Churchill made decisions that changed the course of the war. Hit that like button if you want to see more stories about the real conversations and conflicts that history books often gloss over, and share this with anyone who needs to understand that leadership isn't about always being right, but about what you do when everything goes wrong. Leave a comment telling us what you think Churchill should have said in this moment, and stick around because what actually happened is more revealing than any Hollywood movie could capture. The situation that confronted Churchill in mid-December 1944 was the culmination of decisions made months earlier, when the Allied High Command had chosen speed over caution in their pursuit of the retreating German armies. After the breakout from Normandy in August, American and British forces had raced across France, liberating Paris on August 25 and reaching the German border by September. Eisenhower had implemented a broad front strategy, advancing along the entire line from Switzerland to the North Sea, rather than concentrating his forces for a single knockout blow as British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery had advocated. This strategic disagreement had created tension within the Allied command structure, with Montgomery pressing for a narrow thrust into Germany's industrial heartland while Eisenhower insisted on maintaining pressure across the entire front. Churchill had largely stayed out of this tactical debate, trusting Eisenhower's judgment and recognizing that the Supreme Commander had to balance military effectiveness with political realities, including the fact that American forces now outnumbered British troops in Europe by a significant margin. By December, the Allied armies were stretched thin along a 400-mile front, with some divisions holding sectors that would normally require twice as many troops. The Ardennes sector, a heavily forested region of Belgium and Luxembourg, was particularly vulnerable, defended primarily by Green American divisions that had never seen combat and exhausted units pulled from other sectors to rest and refit. Intelligence officers had warned of German buildups opposite the Ardennes, but these warnings had been dismissed or downplayed by officers who believed the Germans lacked the strength for major offensive operations. Hitler, however, had been planning Operation Watch on the Rhine, a massive surprise attack designed to split the Allied armies, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and force the Western powers to negotiate a separate peace. On the morning of December 16, more than 200,000 German troops supported by hundreds of tanks crashed through the American lines in the Ardennes, achieving complete tactical surprise and sending shockwaves through the Allied command structure. The initial German assault was devastating in its ferocity and effectiveness, shattering 2 entire American divisions and creating a bulge in the Allied lines that would give the battle its name. German soldiers, many dressed in American uniforms and speaking English, spread confusion behind the lines, cutting communication cables and misdirecting traffic at critical junctions. Entire American regiments were surrounded and forced to surrender, while others fought desperate delaying actions that bought precious time for reinforcements to arrive. The town of Bastogne, a critical road junction in Belgium, was quickly surrounded by German forces, trapping the 101st Airborne Division and elements of other units in what would become one of the most famous sieges of the war. Eisenhower's headquarters at Versailles was slow to grasp the magnitude of the crisis, initially treating the German attack as a local counterattack rather than the major offensive it actually was. By December 17, however, The scope of the disaster was becoming clear, and Eisenhower was facing the possibility that his armies might be split in two, with catastrophic consequences for the entire war effort. The Supreme Commander moved quickly to shift reinforcements toward the threatened sector, pulling divisions from quiet areas and rushing them into the battle, but the roads were clogged with refugees and retreating soldiers, and the weather prevented effective air support. German armored spearheads were advancing rapidly toward the Meuse River, the last major obstacle before Antwerp, and if they crossed it, the entire Allied position in northern Europe would be compromised. Churchill, monitoring the situation from London, recognized that this crisis was unlike anything the Allies had faced since the dark days of 1940, and he knew that Eisenhower needed support, not criticism, even as some British officers were questioning the American commander's competence. The Prime Minister also understood that this moment would reveal whether the Anglo-American alliance was strong enough to withstand not just German attacks but also the internal tensions that threatened to pull it apart. Churchill's relationship with Eisenhower had always been complex, marked by genuine respect but also by fundamental differences in temperament and strategic vision. The British Prime Minister was a veteran of the First World War, scarred by the memory of futile offensives and pointless casualties, and he approached military operations with a caution born of bitter experience. Eisenhower, by contrast, represented a new generation of American leadership, confident in American industrial might and convinced that aggressive action was the path to victory. Churchill had initially harbored doubts about Eisenhower's appointment as Supreme Commander, preferring a British general for the role, but he had come to appreciate Eisenhower's diplomatic skills and his ability to maintain unity among fractious allies. The two men had worked closely together since the North African Campaign of 1942, when Eisenhower had commanded his first major operation, and Churchill had often served as both mentor and critic, offering advice that was sometimes welcomed and sometimes resented. Now, with the German offensive tearing through the Ardennes, Churchill had to decide how to approach Eisenhower without appearing to undermine his authority or give comfort to those who wanted to replace him with Montgomery. The British Field Marshal, prickly and egotistical, had never hidden his disdain for Eisenhower's broad front strategy, and he was already suggesting that the crisis vindicated his call for a concentrated thrust under British command. Churchill knew that any hint of British criticism at this moment could inflame American sensitivities and damage the alliance, but he also knew that sometimes friendship required honest conversation rather than empty reassurance. The Prime Minister's private secretary later recalled that Churchill spent hours on December 17 composing and discarding messages to Eisenhower, searching for words that would strengthen rather than weaken the Supreme Commander's resolve. What Churchill ultimately decided to say would reveal not just his diplomatic skill but his fundamental understanding of leadership and loyalty. On December 18, Churchill sent his first message to Eisenhower, and the tone was strikingly different from what many expected. Rather than criticizing the Supreme Commander or demanding explanations, Churchill offered unconditional support and reassurance. He wrote that he had complete confidence in Eisenhower's leadership and that Britain would provide whatever assistance was needed to defeat the German offensive. Churchill emphasized that setbacks were inevitable in war and that what mattered was not avoiding mistakes but responding to them with courage and determination. He reminded Eisenhower that the Germans were exhausting their last reserves in this attack and that every day they were delayed brought the Allies closer to ultimate victory. The message was carefully crafted to boost Eisenhower's morale without seeming patronizing, to offer help without implying incompetence, and to maintain alliance unity without ignoring legitimate concerns. Churchill also made concrete offers of British reinforcements, promising to transfer divisions from quiet sectors to support the American forces bearing the brunt of the attack. This commitment was significant because it meant stripping British-held areas of troops and placing them under American command, a gesture that demonstrated Churchill's trust in Eisenhower's judgment. The Prime Minister's message arrived at Versailles at a moment when Eisenhower was grappling with enormous pressure from all sides, including from his own staff, some of whom were questioning his decisions. Churchill's vote of confidence gave Eisenhower the political backing he needed to resist calls for panic measures and to stick with his plan of containing the German advance and then counterattacking. Years later, Eisenhower would describe Churchill's message as one of the most important he received during the war, not because it contained new information or brilliant strategy, but because it came at the exact moment when he most needed to know that his allies believed in him. We're exactly halfway through this story, and if you're starting to understand how leadership really works when everything is falling apart, then this is the perfect moment to subscribe to the channel because we're going to keep bringing you these untold stories of crisis and decision. Smash that like button if you're glad we're not giving you the sanitized textbook version of history but the real human drama of leaders under pressure, and share this video with someone who thinks they know everything about World War II but has never heard about this conversation. Drop a comment right now telling us what you've learned so far that you didn't know before, and let's continue because what Churchill did next was even more revealing than what he said. Behind Churchill's public support for Eisenhower lay a private calculation about the changing balance of power within the alliance and the post-war world that was already taking shape. By December 1944, Britain was exhausted, nearly bankrupt, and increasingly dependent on American economic and military support. Churchill understood that British influence in Allied councils rested not on military strength, which was clearly declining relative to American power, but on diplomatic skill and the personal relationships he had cultivated with Roosevelt and Eisenhower. Any attempt to undermine Eisenhower or to push for British command of the crisis response would have backfired spectacularly, alienating American public opinion and giving ammunition to those in Washington who already questioned Britain's role in the alliance. Churchill also recognized that Eisenhower, despite his current difficulties, had proven himself a capable coalition commander who prioritized alliance unity over national advantage, a quality that would be essential in managing post-war Europe. The Prime Minister's support for Eisenhower was therefore both genuine and strategic, reflecting his belief that the Supreme Commander was the right man for the job and his understanding that backing him was in Britain's long-term interest. Churchill did, however, have serious concerns about the tactical situation and about whether Eisenhower's staff was giving him accurate information about the crisis. British intelligence officers reported that the American command structure was showing signs of strain, with some units losing communication with headquarters and others receiving contradictory orders. Churchill decided to send his personal representative, Field Marshal Alan Brooke, to Versailles to assess the situation firsthand and to offer British assistance in coordinating the response. Brooke, who served as chief of the Imperial General Staff, was a brilliant strategist but also notoriously critical of American military competence, and Churchill had to carefully instruct him to observe and assist rather than criticize and interfere. The relationship between Brooke and Eisenhower was cordial but not warm, and Churchill knew that Brooke's presence could either help stabilize the situation or create new tensions depending on how he handled himself. While Churchill was managing the diplomatic and strategic aspects of the crisis, the battle in the Ardennes was reaching its critical phase. By December 20th, the German advance had created a bulge 50 miles deep and 70 miles wide in the Allied lines, but the attackers were beginning to run into serious problems. American resistance, though initially chaotic, was stiffening at key points, with isolated garrisons fighting desperate delaying actions that disrupted German timetables. The 101st Airborne Division and attached units in Bastogne were refusing demands to surrender, and their defense of the vital crossroads was preventing German armor from reaching the Meuse. General George Patton, commanding the Third Army to the south, had performed a logistical miracle by disengaging from his own offensive and wheeling 3 divisions northward to strike the southern flank of the German penetration. Patton's aggressive counterattack, launched on December 22, began to relieve pressure on the surrounded garrison at Bastogne and threatened to cut off the German spearheads. In the north, Montgomery had taken command of American forces cut off from Eisenhower's headquarters by the German advance, a move that was militarily sensible but politically controversial because it seemed to validate British criticisms of American leadership. Churchill watched these developments with a mixture of relief and concern, pleased that the line was holding but worried that Montgomery's role in the battle might create lasting resentment. The British Field Marshal, never known for tact, was already making comments to the press that suggested the Americans had bungled the situation and that only British intervention had saved the day. Churchill knew that such statements, even if they contained elements of truth, were politically toxic and threatened to poison relations between the two armies. On December 28, Churchill sent an urgent message to Montgomery, essentially ordering him to stop making public comments that criticized American leadership and to give full credit to American troops for their fighting spirit and sacrifice. The weather, which had grounded Allied aircraft and aided the German advance, finally cleared on December 23, allowing massive air support that turned the tide of the battle. American and British bombers struck German supply columns and armored formations, destroying vehicles and disrupting the logistics that sustained the offensive. Fighter bombers attacked German positions around Bastogne, supporting Patton's relief column and preventing the Germans from overwhelming the defenders. The Luftwaffe, appearing in strength for the first time in months, fought desperately to contest Allied air superiority but was overwhelmed by sheer numbers. Eisenhower, regaining control of the situation, organized a methodical counteroffensive designed to pinch off the German salient and destroy the forces inside it. Churchill, monitoring the battle from London, continued to send messages of encouragement and support, never once suggesting that Eisenhower should be replaced or that command arrangements should be changed. The Prime Minister's steadfast backing of the Supreme Commander contrasted sharply with the second-guessing that was occurring in some quarters, including from some British officers who thought Montgomery should be given overall command. Churchill understood that such a change would have been militarily unnecessary and politically catastrophic, destroying the foundation of trust that made coalition warfare possible. Instead, Churchill focused on ensuring that British forces made maximum contribution to the battle, transferring additional divisions and providing logistical support that allowed Eisenhower to concentrate American forces at the critical points. By early January 1945, the German offensive had been decisively defeated, with Hitler's armies having lost thousands of tanks, aircraft, and irreplaceable veteran troops in an operation that achieved nothing strategic and hastened Germany's collapse. The Battle of the Bulge, as it came to be known, was a defining moment not just militarily but politically, revealing the strains and strengths of the Anglo-American alliance. Churchill's handling of the crisis demonstrated his understanding that coalition warfare required subordinating national pride to collective success, and that sometimes the best way to lead was to support another leader's authority rather than claiming it for yourself. His public and private messages to Eisenhower during the crisis were masterclasses in diplomatic communication, offering support without seeming condescending, providing help without implying incompetence, and maintaining unity without ignoring legitimate concerns. Churchill also had to manage his own military chiefs, particularly Montgomery, who were eager to claim credit for Allied success and critical of American mistakes. The Prime Minister's reprimand to Montgomery in late December was unusually sharp, with Churchill making clear that British interests required praising American courage and competence rather than highlighting their errors. Montgomery, to his credit, eventually gave a press conference on January 7, 1945, in which he praised American troops and acknowledged Eisenhower's leadership, though his phrasing was still sufficiently ambiguous that some American officers remained offended. Churchill spent considerable time repairing the damage Montgomery had done, sending personal messages to American commanders and to President Roosevelt assuring them of British respect and admiration. The episode revealed the fundamental asymmetry in the alliance, with Britain needing American power more than America needed British support, and Churchill navigating this reality with remarkable skill and pragmatism. What Churchill actually said to Eisenhower during the Battle of the Bulge crisis was less important than what he didn't say, and his restraint was as revealing as his words. He never criticized Eisenhower's broad front strategy, even though the crisis seemed to vindicate Montgomery's call for a concentrated thrust. He never suggested that American intelligence had failed or that American troops had performed poorly, even though both criticisms had some validity. He never demanded changes in command arrangements or insisted on greater British control, even though British forces were playing a crucial role in containing the German advance. Instead, Churchill focused relentlessly on maintaining alliance unity and supporting Eisenhower's authority, understanding that these intangible factors were as important to victory as divisions and tanks. The Prime Minister's private papers from this period reveal a man deeply worried about the immediate military situation, but even more concerned about the long-term health of the Anglo-American partnership. Churchill knew that the war in Europe would be won regardless of the Ardennes setback, but he also knew that the post-war world would be shaped by the relationships forged during the conflict. His investment in Eisenhower's success was therefore an investment in the future, building personal trust and institutional cooperation that would outlast the war itself. When Eisenhower later became President of the United States, he would remember Churchill's loyalty during the crisis and would value the Prime Minister's counsel on Cold War challenges. The relationship between the two men, tested in the fires of December 1944, became a foundation for the special relationship between Britain and America in the decades that followed. The broader context of Churchill's response to the Ardennes crisis reveals his sophisticated understanding of military-political dynamics and his ability to think several moves ahead. By December 1944, Churchill was already deeply concerned about Soviet intentions in Eastern Europe and about the post-war balance of power. The Yalta Conference, where the Big Three would meet to decide Europe's future, was just weeks away, and Churchill knew that British influence at that conference would depend partly on maintaining close ties with the Americans. Any rift with Eisenhower or any appearance of British attempts to control American forces would have weakened Churchill's position relative to Stalin, who was already maneuvering to maximize Soviet gains. Churchill's support for Eisenhower during the Bulge crisis was therefore part of a larger strategy of maintaining Western unity in the face of growing Soviet ambitions. The Prime Minister also understood that the German offensive, while dangerous, was ultimately a strategic mistake that would hasten Nazi Germany's collapse by exhausting reserves that could have been used to defend against Soviet offensives in the East. Every tank and soldier Hitler committed to the Ardennes was one fewer available to hold the Vistula or the Oder, and the resulting Soviet advances in January and February 1945 would bring the Red Army deep into Central Europe. Churchill's nightmare scenario was that the Western Allies would be weakened by internal divisions while the Soviets grew stronger, and preventing that outcome required maintaining absolute unity with Eisenhower and the Americans. The Ardennes crisis was therefore never just about defeating a German attack, but about positioning the alliance for the peace that would follow. Churchill's communications with Roosevelt during the Bulge crisis were also revealing, showing how he worked to maintain American confidence in both Eisenhower and in the alliance. The president, dealing with failing health and his own political challenges, was sensitive to any suggestion that American forces were performing poorly or that British leadership was superior. Churchill was careful to frame his messages to Roosevelt in terms of shared challenges and collective response, never suggesting that British wisdom was rescuing American mistakes. He emphasized the courage and determination of American troops, particularly the surrounded garrison at Bastogne, and he publicly praised Eisenhower's coolness under pressure. Churchill also used his correspondence with Roosevelt to counter Montgomery's unfortunate public statements, assuring the president that the British field marshal's comments did not reflect British government policy and that Churchill personally had complete confidence in American leadership. These messages were crucial in preventing the military crisis from becoming a political crisis that could have fractured the alliance. Roosevelt, reassured by Churchill's loyalty, continued to back Eisenhower and to resist calls from some quarters for changes in command structure. The episode demonstrated the importance of personal relationships in coalition warfare and the value of Churchill's decades of experience in navigating the treacherous waters of alliance politics. Unlike Montgomery, who saw military situations primarily in tactical terms, Churchill understood that every battle was also a political event with consequences far beyond the immediate outcome. The aftermath of the Battle of the Bulge saw Churchill working to ensure that the alliance emerged stronger rather than weaker from the crisis. He gave speeches in Parliament praising American sacrifice and competence, and he wrote personal letters to American commanders thanking them for their leadership. Churchill also moved to address some of the underlying issues that had contributed to the crisis, including intelligence failures and the overstretching of Allied forces along the front. He supported Eisenhower's decision to maintain the broad front strategy rather than shifting to Montgomery's preferred narrow thrust, recognizing that the Supreme Commander needed to balance military effectiveness with political realities. Churchill also began planning for the next phase of the war, including the crossing of the Rhine and the final drive into Germany, and he worked to ensure that British forces would play a prominent role in these operations. The Prime Minister was acutely aware that as British military contribution declined relative to American strength, British political influence would decline as well unless he could maintain the personal relationships and institutional partnerships that gave Britain outsized impact. His handling of the Bulge crisis was therefore part of a larger effort to preserve British relevance in an alliance increasingly dominated by American power.